All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's hybrid presentation, Exotic Invasive Plants of the Pajarito Plateau. This is with Sam Loftin. Peak is hosting this program in collaboration with Los Alamos Community Seed Library Project. This is a grassroots effort comprised of individuals and community organizations working together to continue the success of the seed libraries in Los Alamos County. A seed library is a location where the general public can borrow seeds to plant at their own homes. Borrowers are encouraged to collect seeds from their home gardens to return back to the library to share with others. Before we get started, I want to make sure everyone knows this presentation is being recorded. I am Kristen O'Hara,
a lot of
Director
background
of
noise.
Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEAC as we like to call it, located in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I will be the moderator for tonight's talk. Again, if you could please turn your video off if you're a Zoom member. Thank you so much. All right, so PEAC is a nonprofit. There we go. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so PEAC is the nonprofit that operates the Los Alamos Nature Center. Visit our website, pec.nature.org, to learn more about visiting our nature center and upcoming programs. And I'd like to give a shout out to PEAC's wonderful members, donors, and volunteers.
It doesn't know the way I talk. A lot of people talk like me.
Sorry, you don't have to go back here. I'm going to do that. Right. To learn more details about becoming a PEAC member, donor, or volunteer, please visit our website or scan the QR code right in front of you on the screen. Or if you're an in-person audience, grab a brochure on your way out. Okay, just a few logistics before this presentation starts. This is, again, a hybrid talk, meaning there are folks virtually with us on Zoom and people here in the room with me. For those tuning in on Zoom, please note that you will not be able to see our presenter, just their slides. For questions, our presenter will be taking questions via Zoom chat and from our in-person audience at the end of the presentation. To find the chat feature on Zoom, look for the Zoom chat menu bar and type your questions in there. I will relay them to Sam at the end. Also, for those of you on Zoom, there might be a slight delay while an audience member in audience at the Nature Center is asking a question. Hang tight. We will try to repeat that question as soon as we can. And of course, after this presentation, if you would be so kind to fill out the short evaluation you will receive in your email. It really helps us improve our programming. And now, a bit about tonight's presenter. Sam Loftin grew up in Western Oregon and moved to New Mexico in 1986 to attend graduate school at UNM. He worked for 5 years with the Forest Service Research Station in Albuquerque before joining LANL in 1998. Sam worked in both the ecology and water quality groups before retiring in 2021. We are very thankful that Sam is joining us this evening and sharing his expertise. I will turn it over to him now and monitor the chat for questions. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoy.
Yeah. Is it working? All right. Okay, great. Thank you, Kristen. Oh, I can't set this down. This has to go in my pocket. All right. Thank you all for attending. When Kristen told me we had over 50, 60, almost 60 people registered for this talk, I thought, this town is crazy. There's going to be something else going on a Thursday night. But I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your interest in the topic. And I probably should have called this more exotic plants of the Pajarito Plateau. Some of them are invasive. They aren't all particularly invasive, but all except one is not native to New Mexico, or for the most part to North America. As Kristen said, we'll save the questions to the end. That makes it easier for the folks online, but do take note. I prefer this to be more of a discussion, but that's a little harder with the online stuff. But I would like your feedback on some of these more uncommon types and problematic types. I wander around my neighborhood and Craig's neighborhood and see certain things, but I don't get down into White Rock or a lot of other areas and look around all that much. So I'd be interested to know what you folks are seeing. There's a lot of good botanists here in Los Alamos, a lot of them, some of them in this room, and many of them better botanists than I am for sure. So I know people are seeing things out there, and we'd be really interested in knowing exactly what's out there. So first off, let's get some terminology out of the way because I'm going to be throwing a lot of these around during this presentation, so we should know what we're talking about. So first, weed. That's a real common term. It's the same word, and I just looked this up. Old, like Middle English, Dutch, and German. Weed or woad is an old term for basically any unwanted plant, native or exotic. It's just a plant growing somewhere where you don't want it growing. So it may be a weed in your garden, but out in the woods, it's not a weed. Okay. So exotic means non-native and did not originate in the area where it's growing. Pretty much everything I'll talk about, except for one, is not native to North America. One of them is supposedly native to North America, but not necessarily to New Mexico. Invasive. This means it's aggressive and it will move from your garden, let's say, out into a native habitat. So it actually will encroach on native habitats. And then noxious is not a term I use all that much, but it is one that the state uses. So it's designated by, in our case, the state agricultural or governing authority, a plant that is injurious to agricultural or horticultural crops, natural habitats or ecosystems, humans or livestock. Okay, there is a New Mexico noxious weed list. Okay, noxious. And I don't fully understand how plants get on to this list because there seem to be some gaps when I look at it. But there is a noxious weed list. The latest one was updated in 2020. I'm not really sure how often they update these things. It's maintained by the New Mexico Department of Agriculture. And as required by the New Mexico Noxious Weed Management Act, the following plant species are designated as noxious weeds to be targeted for control or eradication. And the New Mexico list is split up into 3 different classes, and we'll address those by class. I'm not going to talk about all the plants on those, just the ones that I've either seen here in the county or I think are probably here in the county, even though I maybe haven't seen them. I'm not going to talk a lot about control measures. Like you, I pull a lot of weeds in my yard all my life. I've been pulling weeds, and so there of course is that. It's effective on a small scale, perhaps, if you've got the energy to do it. One thing I will point out, if you're pulling weeds and there's seeds on them, don't throw them in the brown bin, right? Because that goes to the mulch pile or something like that, or compost. In theory, the heat generated by the composting process could kill some of them, but it's not necessarily going to kill all of the seeds. So it's a good idea if your stuff has seeds on it, stick it in a trash bag and put it in the garbage. One way to control natives, particularly or non-natives, particularly ones that are on disturbed areas, is to try to establish native grasses or native plants to outcompete some of the non-natives. And if you're building or disturbing land around your property, minimize just disturb what you need to get the job done, and try not to disturb anything else. It reduces weeds. It reduces the gophers. Gophers are a huge problem when it comes to trying to stabilize disturbed areas. You walk around out in the woods, you don't see a lot of sign of gophers, but as soon as you disturb something, it's like every gopher in the neighborhood moves in, starts rototilling everything, and just maintains it in this early successional stage and full of weeds. So, I moved into my place 5 years ago, and I'm still trying to control the gophers. And then I'm not going to talk much about herbicides. I'll go to Metzger's Roundup or something like that. I'm not promoting the use of herbicides, but sometimes some of these are really hard to tackle. Particularly, I'll point out the rhizomatous perennial plants that are really hard to control. There are other options for herbicides. The more powerful stuff, you need a permit from the state. Places like probably open space, or at least the county and the state. LANL has folks that are permitted to use some of these more effective herbicides. So those are options that might be available to us, but it's not something that you and I are likely to have access to. Okay, let's start off with Class A species off of the state list. And we'll go through all the plants on the state list, and then I've got a bunch of plants that are not on the state list that we'll try to get through all of them. I've got about 45 plants to talk about, I think. So Class A species, these are the high priority ones. Currently not present in New Mexico or have limited distribution. Preventing new infestations of these species and eradicating existing infestations is the highest priority. So these are supposedly the most problematic species. This is one I have not seen in New Mexico, but a couple of years ago, I ran across this at Eagle Nest State Park, and I had no idea what it was. Took some pictures, actually took some specimens, came back and got online and figured out what this was. This is called black henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. It's in the Solanaceae. It's from Europe and Siberia, and it's an annual or a biennial. This is kind of an interesting historical plant. It's been used to both for poisons and for medicines. I think there's kind of a fine line there, but it's pretty common in like ancient European folklore and whatnot as a plant that's used for poisons and for medicinal purposes. Again, I haven't seen it here. I got a hold of the state parks, told them about it. Supposedly they went out and removed it, but I saw more last year. So it's still out there, and it's not something that we want to see spreading around to our county for sure. So keep your eyes open for this. It's around, but I haven't seen it up here. It's a big plant too, and kind of a showy plant. And Canada thistle. This is one of 4 different thistles that we'll talk about. Cirsium arvense. It's an aster family. It's from Europe and Western Asia and North Africa. This is one of those rhizomatous perennials I was talking about, which is unusual for a thistle. Most of them are biennial plants, whereas this is a perennial. It's smaller. Does this thing have a pointer? Yeah, okay. So the flower heads are smaller than the plant in general is smaller than the other thistles that we'll talk about. And it's not as spiny. It has some spines on the leaves, but the flower heads are not really all that spiny. It'll get up to 3 or 4 feet, maybe taller if it's got some water. This one's is maybe a little harder to deal with because it's a perennial and it's a rhizomatous perennial. You can't just pull the tops out and it just resprouts. This is Dalmatian toadflax, Linaria dalmatica. It's in the plantain family and from the Mediterranean, another rhizomatous perennial. I've got this growing in the little I live on 36th Street. There's a little canyon between 36th Street and 35th Street. Stuff in there. And this is one of them that I try to pull up. It's an attractive plant, was probably brought in as an ornamental and escaped from gardens. Looks a lot like a snapdragon. You see the flowers here, very much like a snapdragon. So there's 2 different linarias. There's this one, and the next one we'll talk about as the yellow-toed flax. And the main difference is the leaves. The leaves on the Dalmatian are thick or wide, I should say. Looks kind of like a spurge. When you don't see any flowers on it, looks a little bit like a spurge. This is the yellow-toed flax. Don't know that I've seen this. I'm pretty sure it's around, but I don't know that I've seen this one. And you can see here the leaves are linear, like long and linear. So it looks different from the Dalmatian toad flax. And this is one of the plants. And there are several like these that were brought in as ornamental. So they're nice looking plants. And I always kind of look around before I pull one up because I don't want somebody yelling at me for pulling up the pretty flowers, but do it anyway. Yeah. Another rhizomatous perennial. This is hoary cress or white top Lepidium draba. It's a mustard, a perennial mustard from Eastern Europe and West Asia. And we have this around here. There's some alongside the golf course. There along Diamond Drive on the golf course. I've seen it at the lab. As you get up further north, there's more of it. If you've ever been to Dulce on the Jicarilla, they have a lot of pasture land up there. And they're almost wet meadows. I think this time of year they are really wet. And this stuff just thrives with a little extra water. And they just have huge patches of this stuff moving into their meadows up there. And they've got a real problem with it up there. And in Taos, it's all through downtown Taos. If you walk through Taos this time of year, this stuff is just growing up through cracks in the sidewalk and just all over the place. Leafy spurge. You may have heard of this one, Euphorbia escula in the Euphorbia family from Europe, another rhizomatous perennial. I've seen this up here, but not very much of it. There's another spurge we'll talk about that's a little more common. This one used to be a huge problem, like in Minnesota and the Midwest, was get into wheat fields and agricultural crops and pasture lands and whatnot. But apparently they have identified some little beetle that they've released, and they're getting some control over this plant. You're shaking your head. I didn't even know they had anything. They'd identified anything that would attack this plant. But anyway, another one we definitely don't want to get a foothold up here. We're kind of fortunate. A lot of these plants don't really do well at our elevation. I guess it's the winters are too cold or something. So we see them, but it's not like they're really getting out of control. And then this is the other spurge that I'm aware of. Again, this is a photo from the canyon behind my house. This is myrtle spurge, Euphorbia mercenites, from Southeast Europe and Asia Minor. Another herbaceous perennial. I don't think this one is rhizomatous because you can pull it out of the ground relatively easy. It just seems to have tap roots running around. And most of these are gone. I was out pulling them one day and some folks walked by and said, oh, we were out last week pulling those things. So I guess I'm not the only one who's wandering around the neighborhood and pulling up some of these plants. But there's still quite a bit of this in the canyon there, but not, big patches of it like this. I have seen photos from areas around Salt Lake City where apparently it's really a problem. You just got big, huge patches, like monoculture patches of this stuff. And this is another ornamental. It's a nice looking plant, and a lot of my neighbors have them in their yards. You'll see this in a lot of yards around. So apparently you can still pick it up at a nursery and plant it. And it's a nice plant, but it just won't stay put. Another ornamental. I mentioned I grew up in Oregon. This was all over the place in Western Oregon. We had a lot of this oxeye daisy, and we didn't know it was a weed. We just thought it was a wildflower. Leucanthemum vulgare from Europe and Asia, herbaceous perennial. Again, I don't think this is rhizomatous. There's not a lot of this around, but it's definitely around. I've seen it on Woodland Park or Woodland Trail anyway, and I've seen it throughout New Mexico, but it's definitely up here. Okay, so here's one of the four thistles that we'll talk about. This is Scotch thistle, Onoportum acanthium, from Europe and West Asia. It's a biennial. Most of the thistles, including the native thistles, are pretty much all biennials that I know of. Scotch thistle, you can identify if you look at the photo on the left here. You can see the what they're called wings along the stems there. It's almost like it's photosynthetic leafy type material, spiny, leafy, that grows out from the stems. And that's really the only one of these thistles I'll talk about that have these wings along the stems. For the most part, they're all purple flowers, spiny bracts below the inflorescence there. And then I want to point out this area. This is here in Los Alamos, just a few block or so down from my place off of Arizona Avenue. And this is all Scotch thistle, along with some Russian olive and an elm tree. It's a real mixed bag out here. But the main issue here is the Scotch thistle. It's Eric Peterson at the County Open Space told me about this. And he said, well, you're right there. Just walk down the street and walk over this private property and look at this little drainage back behind there. It's like, oh my God. So I've since heard that maybe we might get a group together to tackle some of this. I'd kind of thought about taking this on my own since it's right next to my house, but that would be awesome if there's a group of people that wanted to gang up on these things. It's difficult to control. I mean, it's a biennial, so you could dig it up, but when there's so much of it, and then the seeds they're viable for like 20 years or something like that. So that's a long time. So you've got to deal with the seed bank every year coming up and producing more seeds. Okay, move on to Class B species. So these are limited to portions of the state in areas with severe infestations. We're trying to design management to contain them and stop further spread. Okay, we've given up on eradication. There's just too much of it, too many of these plants out to really eradicate it. Yeah, we can do that in our own yards, of course, but on a landscape, broad scale, it's going to be really difficult. So here's one of the other thistles. This is bull thistle. And this one, I'm not sure I've seen this one in the county. I know I've seen all the others, but have you seen it? Okay, so it's here. I figured it was. I just wasn't certain that I had seen it. Cirsium vulgare, and again, Europe, Western Asia, North Africa. That's pretty common. Most of our plants are invasives come from this area, and it's a biennial, like most of the others. You can see here it doesn't have the wings on the stems. It's more of a greenish color and not as pale as the Scotch thistle. The biennials start out as a rosette like that. They spend the first year as a rosette, and then the second year they bolt and produce flowering stems. Again, purple flowers, spiny bracts below the inflorescence. That part really isn't all that helpful to identify these things. Chicory, Chicorium intybus, is another aster from Europe, West Asia, North Africa. This is an herbaceous perennial. I've seen this around, not a lot of it, doesn't seem to be a big problem, but you'll see it once in a while. And it's kind of an ornamental. You can also use the roots as a coffee substitute. I'm sure you've probably heard of folks back in the Depression or the war that you can roast the roots and grind them up and use them as a coffee substitute. You can eat the leaves. I mean, they make horticultural or agricultural varieties that you can use in salad, I guess. So again, it's here, but not necessarily problematic. Perennial pepperweed, Lepidium latifolium, is another mustard from Europe and South Asia. This was a herbaceous perennial. I've seen this at the lab. It kind of likes a little extra water. I've seen this growing, where the pond is right next to the main entrance to the lab. I saw it there one year. I didn't see it there the next year, but it was there. And I've seen it down at on the Cochiti Reservoir too. So it's around, but doesn't seem to be like getting out of control around here. You can see by this photo here up off of the highway, and pretty much all these photos are just ones I pulled off the web. I'll let you know if they're actually from around here, but most of these are just, I have no idea where they were taken. But this is probably getting water coming off of the pavement here. So getting a little extra water on the side of the road. That's a common theme with a lot of these things. You'll see them on roadside corridors and not necessarily out into the, whatever's beyond that. But they travel a long ways getting picked up along these roadsides. Cocklebur, two different types, Xanthium spinosum and Xanthium strumarium. So that's spiny cocklebur and common cocklebur. And these are asters as well. And at least the spiny one is from South America. It's our only representative here from South America. Common cocklebur is from Europe. It's a perennial as well. It doesn't really spread. It spreads by seeds for the most part. I think we all know what cockleburs are. They get caught up in your socks and your pants and your dog's fur and whatnot, and they just wind up all over the place. So you can tell the difference. The spiny one, you see all these nasty, long spines on it. This one is not near as common, obviously, as common cocklebur. This one right here. The fruits look pretty much the same, but the leaves are a lot different than the common cocklebur. They're much broader leaves, and it doesn't have the spines. This is a kind of a horse nettle type thing. It's a really nasty little plant. I'd tell you to pull this one up too, but wear gloves if you're going to pull it up. And teasel, common teasel, Dipsacus phelonum. This used to be, when I learned all of this stuff, this was in its own family, but somebody's been doing genetic work on this stuff and decided it's a honeysuckle of some sort, Caprifoliaceae, from Europe, Asia, North Africa. It's also an herbaceous perennial. It starts out as this kind of rosette thing, and then later in the season it bolts into these funny looking inflorescences here. These are individual flowers that kind of flower in rings up through this whole bract structure here. And these were imported. They were traditionally used. The name teasel comes from, they use it to tease wool. So they would weave wool and then they'd use it to tease wool to kind of fluff it up and make it increase the nap on it, I guess is what it's called. So that's what it originally came in, how it got here. Okay, Class C species. Widespread in the state. You'll probably be familiar with all of these. Management decisions for these species should be determined at the local level based on feasibility of control and level of infestation. So there's a lot of these around, and most people have just kind of thrown up their hands like, okay, unless we can find some bug that's going to eat these things, we're just going to have to live with them. We pull them out of our yards because that's doable. And if you've got some like high value bark or something like that, you might put some extra resources into trying to control these. But for the most part, a lot of these have naturalized. They're out in the environment, and we're just going to have to learn to live with them. Cheatgrass. I think we all know what cheatgrass is. Bromus tectorum from Europe, South Asia, North Africa. It's an annual grass. It's also called downy brome. When the leaves are small, they're kind of fuzzy and fluffy. And up here, if you have a nice wet spring, you're going to have a lot of cheatgrass. And this is a pretty good year with there's cheatgrass coming up all over the place. It's one of the first things to green up in the spring. And it's one of the first things to mature in kind of the late spring and into the summer. It matures pretty early. So this is what the seed heads look like when they're relatively young. Don't throw those in the pan bucket. This is what it looks like when they're mature. So they kind of spread out and get kind of fluffy and wind up in your socks and in all kinds of places. And yeah, it's everywhere. And it's we're just going to have to live with this. And this is jointed goat grass. I kind of like this. Aegilops cylindrica. It's a cool name. Southern Europe, Russia, another annual grass, possibly related to like a progenitor to wheat. And it's got these cool spikelets. It is very cylindrical, and you can see the segments. And when it matures, it breaks up into these little cylindrical little seeds. And it's definitely in Los Alamos. I've seen it, all over town and on the lab. I don't see a lot of it, but it's around. It's definitely around. It's not like cheatgrass. And here is, I think, the last of the big thistles. This is musk thistle or nodding thistle, Cardus nutans, from Europe, Central Asia, North Africa. Again, it's a biennial, like most of the rest, except for the Canada thistle. This one's easy to tell because the heads droop, right? Instead of sticking straight up and having a purple flower and looking like everything else, the heads droop, so it's relatively easy to identify. Doesn't have the wings so much on the stems like Scotch thistle does. So this one's bull thistle is kind of the one I think you have to identify, but by the fact that it doesn't look like the others. At least that's the way it works for me. But this is definitely around. Okay, so then we've got this whole complex of knapweeds and star thistles. And there's multiple species of both of them. And the main way you tell them apart is the star thistles have these nasty spines sticking out from the bracts underneath the inflorescence. The only one that I personally identified up here is this Russian knapweed. Here's what it looks like as a full plant. So that's
She's forgetting what knapweed looks like.
And another rhizomatous perennial. This group of plants is causing a lot of problems across the U.S. And we need to keep an eye on this. I think like 15 years ago, I contacted Craig Martin and said, "Oh, I found a big patch of this out by Aspen Ridge." I don't know if you managed to do anything, but it seems to be gone. I was out there the other day looking for it and couldn't find any coming up right now. I've seen it on the lab, and we sprayed
I'm
some
gonna write down the open
and
house thing.
it'll work relatively
Weird that you
well.
do not make second, but
This is
whatever.
around. There's also some out on the golf course, alongside the golf course. I've seen it out there. So this is something we need to kind of keep our eyes on. There is a ton of it in Milwaukee. You go down to Milwaukee, and it's growing just right out in the pinyon juniper. And I saw it one year, it was like up to my hip and just everywhere down in the pinyon juniper there in the valley. So it's definitely around. There's no way it's not going to find its way up here if there's that much down in the valley. Have not seen any star thistle around here, but it's around. So these ones in particular, I really like to know if people run across these. This is kind of one of the ones that's, as far as the state's concerned, it's everywhere and it's a problem, and maybe we'll try to control it. But as far as I'm concerned, up here, it's not everywhere, and we'd really like to jump on this before it is everywhere. And then Siberian elm, not Chinese elm, Siberian elm. I'm not sure how the whole Chinese thing got started, but it's officially Siberian elm, Ulmus pumila, from Asia. This is kind of a controversial species. Some of us like this. Some of us don't like them. I lean more towards the don't like them side. I wish someone would develop a sterile version of one of these that didn't produce seeds. Then we could all be happy. We could cut down all the nasty ones that are dumping seeds everywhere and plant the sterile ones. But people like them because they're very hardy. They don't need a lot of water. If climate change progresses, this could be the only deciduous shade tree we have left around here. So I understand why people like them, but last year was a really good year for the elms, and I must have raked up 2 5-gallon buckets full of elm seeds, And those are the ones I got. So now I'm dealing with all the 2-year-old elm seedlings that came up everywhere. And, once they get 3 or 4 years old, you can't pull them anymore. They're too deep rooted. And then you're going to get out the Roundup, and nobody likes to do that. So, yeah, they can be a problem. Kind of the same with this one. Russian olive, Elaeagnus angustifolia, in the olive family from Central Asia. And this is what we're familiar with. It's an ornamental. You see it even now planted in people's yards. And the flowers, if it's not flowering yet, it will be soon. Very perfumey. I used to live in Los Lunas and worked in Albuquerque, and every time you drive across the bridge, they're going south through the bosque at the right time of the year, man, it practically knock you over. It's just so perfumey. And then, of course, makes these little olives. They're kind of little dry little things, but the birds still eat them, poop them out all over the place. And you'll find these things growing just in the weirdest places, up in the hills, in the burned hills up there. Here'll be a Russian olive tree coming up. And of course, it's, spiny and nasty if you try to get in there and prune it. It's a nice looking tree, but you don't want to get too close. Kind of the same thing with salt cedar. Several different species of tamarix from Eurasia and Africa. It's both an ornamental, and then a lot of it was brought in to stabilize, soils along drainage ditches and arroyos and whatnot to try to, for erosion control. And of course, it got out of hand. And not so much up here. I think this is one of these that doesn't really like it at this elevation and these temperatures. I've seen it in that gabion structure down in LA, the Y, White Rock Y. I've seen it there, but I haven't really seen it up here in town anywhere. Of course, you get down off the hill and it's everywhere. Tree of Heaven. This is, I think, the only one that comes from China and Taiwan on our list. Ailanthus altissima from the Sima rubaceae. I don't know anything else in that plant family. And what you can see here has really, these are actually leaves. These are compound leaves, and they can be, 2-3 feet long. These are the flowers. They have interesting looking winged ash-like fruits. And again, I don't see a lot of it up here. I lived in Chimayo for a while, and I had a couple of them in my yard, and they're really drought tolerant. They also spread by root suckers. So once you get one started, they just start, popping up all over the place. That one I had 2 in my yard, and my neighbor across the street, there was a gravel road between us and the neighbor across the street, and he had some growing in his yard. And one year I cut both of mine down, and then I treated the stumps with Roundup, and then his trees all dropped all their leaves because they were root suckers off of my original tree. They didn't die. I think he kind of accused me of sneaking out at night and spraying his plants too. They didn't. They came back. It didn't kill them. It did kill the ones in my yard though. So yeah, you won't see too many of these, but it's around. Okay, so that's plants on the state list. Now we'll move into a bunch of about an equal amount of other plants that are around, maybe not all that aggressively invasive. Some of them are, but I just thought, for me, it's interesting just to know that all of this stuff I'm seeing, it's not actually native. It's from somewhere else. There's an awful lot of stuff that didn't originate here. So this first 2 are kind of our tumbleweeds, our annual. This is Kochia or summer cypress, Basius coparia. It's in the spinach family, Chenopodiaceae, from Asia. And I'm sure everyone has seen this. This stuff can get really big. I've lived in places where it was like 6-inch diameter and 7 or 8 feet tall, and you had to have an axe to cut it down. And then, of course, Russian thistle or tumbleweed, Salsola tragus. There's a couple different species also in the Chenopodiaceae. And another annual from Asia, and this also gets big, Amafka every Christmas season puts up this big tumbleweed snowman alongside the freeway there in Albuquerque. He's even made the news a few times. And then goat heads. Yeah, everybody moans. Anybody who's stepped on a goat head in their carpet at bare feet, knows all about goat heads. And these are up here for sure. They're not, again, another plant that doesn't seem to like it up here as much as it does in the valley, but it's definitely around. I've seen this in several places on the lab. There's some in my neighborhood. I've actually, I've picked this out of my own yard a couple of times. Yeah, you're right. This articulates into, I think each piece has like two little prongs that stick out of it and then stick into everything. And it's really hard to control. I lived in Chimayo for like 15 years, and every year I went out and I would collect multiple wheelbarrow loads full of this stuff. And in 15 years, I don't think I made a dent in it. It's like every year the same thing would come back up. Really hard to control. It is an annual, at least you can cut it off and it doesn't grow back, but it just produces so many seeds. And if it's dry or something, you have a little plant like that's about this big and it's just loaded with seeds. And then other times you get plants that are this big around. If there's lots of water around, they get huge. This is one I'm sure you've probably seen, Filary or Rhodium secutarium. It's a little geranium from Eurasia, North Africa. It's another annual. I've got it all over my yard, but it's not really a problem. The seeds aren't really pokey or stickery, so I don't worry too much about it. But it's interesting that it's not native either. A couple of different sweet clovers. This is Melolotus alba here, the white one, and officinalis here, the yellow one. And I think our only plants from the E family, the legume family, from Europe and Asia. It's a biennial, common roadside weed, I guess you could say, disturbed areas. Not great for grazers. It's got some toxins that don't make it good for grazing, but the pollinators love it. Bees and butterflies are just all over this stuff. And it's a nitrogen fixer too. So it's got some good things going for it, even though it's not from here. And then mullein, Verbascum thapsus. This has also been moved into the plantain family. This is from Europe, Asia, and North Africa. And it's a biennial. It starts out as this kind of rosette, not typically this big, but they do get big. This one's in my yard. It's one of those, where are you, like 5, 6, something like that. So this thing's like almost 8 feet tall. And of course it's growing in this nice mulched area. And I let it grow till about here, and then I chopped it down, cut it up, stuck it in a bag, and tossed it out. So I didn't need these things growing all over my yard. But they grow everywhere. If you're out hiking around, they're everywhere. And they do tend to get really high abundance in disturbed areas, but they go everywhere. I don't think they're necessarily invasive to the point where they're displacing a lot of natives. It's just that they grow everywhere. Here's one example of probably many mustards. I'm not really into mustards. I'd rather try to keep out grasses than mustards. Okay, but pansy mustard, Descarania sophia, from Eurasia. It's one of those annual weedy mustards that you see growing around, and they usually die off and then blow around and spread seeds all over the place. But there's, I'm sure, more than one of these that are exotics. Here's yellow salsify or oyster plant. Apparently you can eat the root on these. Looks like a giant dandelion, at least the seed head looks like a giant dandelion about the size of a softball. And again, they're around, but there's not a lot of them. They don't seem to be really problematic. Cheeseweed, malva, a couple of different species, malva neglecta and parviflora. And the mallow family, if you're familiar with mallows, it's got the little mallow flower on it. This is a real common lawn weed, garden weed. And from North Africa, Europe, and Asia, I was kind of surprised that this is an annual. These things have some serious taproots on them. I would have thought they were perennials, but apparently they're annuals. And yeah, because of that taproot, they're kind of hard to control. Kind of like a dandelion. You've got to dig the whole thing out in order to get rid of it. But, they're just little weeds. They don't produce nasty seeds, spines on them or anything like that. So they're not really a big issue. And then bindweed, Convolvulus arvensis. This is in the morning glory family from Europe and Asia. Another rhizomatous perennial and a vine, like a morning glory. And and it's an attractive plant. I don't know if it was actually here because of an ornamental, or some of these things get into weeds as from cereal crops or something like that. There's any number of ways that they get here, but this one can be problematic on kind of a small scale. We should be glad it's not a kudzu vine or something like that. But yeah, I've dosed this stuff with herbicides again and again, and it just keeps coming back up. It's really hard to control, but at least it's somewhat attractive. It doesn't make spiny things. So dandelions, Torexicum officinale, another aster from Europe. We're all familiar with this herbaceous perennial. It's not rhizomatous, it just has a big taproot. And this is obviously some guy's lawn that he wasn't paying attention to, or he likes dandelions. And I'll talk about another later here that we usually see along with the dandelion. We'll get into some grasses here. This is lovegrass, and there's a couple different species around: layman lovegrass and weeping lovegrass, Eragrostis leymaniana and curvula. And these are from South Africa. So these are our only South African grasses or even species. And if you're familiar with grasses, you get up close and, it's got that Eragrostis type of spikelet arrangement. But superficially, it looks like some of our native drop seed plants. And if you're not really paying attention, you don't really notice, right? But this is my yard right here. So it's very aggressive. This stuff was introduced, I think, in southern Arizona. They seeded it in after areas had burned, and it grows very quickly, stabilizes the soils. The only problem is it just spreads all over the place, and it forms monocultures where there's hardly anything else growing, and it rapidly got away from them and spread all over the Southwest. And yeah, this is around, and it is aggressive. Doesn't seem to be like moving into native areas. It seems mostly keyed in on my garden and my yard, disturbed areas where it can get established easily. Crested wheatgrass, another grass that was used a lot for rehab purposes in the Great Basin and whatnot. And so it's around. There's not a lot of it around, but it's around. Agropyron cristatum from Russia. How are we doing time-wise? Yeah, I think we're doing all right. Smooth brome. This is the one I mentioned earlier that is native to North America, but I don't think it's native to this part of North America. But it's everywhere. Bromus inermis. It's a perennial turf grass, not a bunch grass, and it's all through the kind of higher elevations in northern New Mexico. It was spread liberally as after fires and whatnot, and used to stabilize soils by the Forest Service and other government agencies. So it's everywhere, and it's not going. We're not going to get rid of this. It does a good job for what it was intended, but from what I understand, not a lot of things really use this. It's kind of the herbivores don't particularly care for it. But yeah, you'll see this all around Los Alamos. Okay, Kentucky bluegrass. You might have thought it came from Kentucky, but it doesn't. It's from Europe, Poa pratensis. And I don't really know where this is, but it looks like Kentucky. And you can see this, and this kind of seems to have this symbiotic relationship with dandelions, right? You see these two growing together. You'll walk up in the Hemis or over on the other side there and in the forest, and you have a little opening, and here's this patch of Kentucky bluegrass and dandelions growing. How did this get here? Well, it's everywhere. And again, at least it stabilizes the soils. Another meadow grass is orchard grass, Dactylus glomerata from North Africa. This is one that, if you're someone producing hay, you might seed this in to make hay in some of the, higher elevation meadows where they get more water. So this is a common pasture grass. And it's definitely, here in Los Alamos. Same thing with Timothy grass, Fluum pratense from Europe, another perennial bunch grass, kind of a pasture grass. And again, like a lot of these, they're around, but they're not trying to take over the world. Here's an interesting one. This is cheatgrass. I showed you this picture already. The Japanese brome, Bromus japonicus, excuse me. I think our only one from Japan. And looks a lot like brome. It's an annual brome grass, similar to cheatgrass, but the seed heads are a little heavier, and they don't spread out at maturity quite the way that the cheatgrass does. So if you're like me, you're sitting down and you're pulling cheatgrass out of the ground, and all of a sudden there's this one that doesn't quite look right. There's a good chance that it's Japanese brome, because it's definitely around. It's pretty widespread. It's just not nearly as abundant as cheatgrass. But kind of an interesting little thing. Okay, well, good. This is the last one. I threw this one in. It's native, but I hate the little thing. How it ever got the name ambrosia, I know that's like a joke. I don't know. Ambrosia tomentosa, the Asteraceae. It's another rhizomatous perennial. You can spend all day pulling these little tops off, and it just makes the plant angry, I think. And unlike some of the other ambrosias, we had one in Arizona, it was Ambrosia deltoidea, and it made really nasty little burrs. I mean, it's called burr sage for a reason, because it kind of looks like a sage, but it makes these nasty little spiny seeds, kind of like cockleburrs or goat heads that get in your socks and cause a lot of trouble. This one's not so bad on that end, but if you have hay fever, if you have allergies, the pollen in this stuff is just vicious. I mean, it doesn't get very big, at least in my yard. It only gets about this big, but it's one of those things you walk through and your pants are yellow when you get through walking it, and then you start having attacks. So I would encourage anyone to, pull this up and try to control it, especially if you have hay fever and you're wondering why in the late summer you're having such problems. If that's in your yard or anywhere near your yard, that's one of the culprits. Okay, I think that is the last one. Oops, did I want to do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fine. Totally cool.
So, any comments or questions? Anybody seen knapweed or star thistle anywhere that we need to know about?
I have a couple questions that I jotted down just to let everyone think. I have a question about practical removal practices for private homeowners. What are some pointers?
That's kind of what I had on that slide, because
Right.
I'm just kind of going off my own experience of what I've done around my yard is, pull what you can. It's labor intensive, right? You're not going to do that on a large scale basis, but if it's just your yard or your garden and you can pull it, like if it's an annual or if it's a perennial with a taproot, you might be able to get it out of the ground. These rhizomatous species, you're not really I mean, you'd have to pull all those tops out for probably several years in a row before you starve that plant out and it died on its own. So they're really hard. And, I use Roundup for some things. If you do that, be sure to follow the instructions and be careful with it. It's not, it's not something you want to mess with.
Right. Large areas like you pointed out in that sort of gully area with all the thistles, what would be a treatment, say if,
Well,
you
with
inherited a house and that was your backyard?
Yeah, with the thistles, you can address them in the spring when they're rosettes if you want to try to pull them up. Okay, we're not gonna touch on herbicides. Any of these, you can use herbicides if you really want to, but we try to stay away from that. So you can try to pull those rosettes and get the taproot out. You've still got the last year's plants hanging around. They could have seeds still on them. So you may want to cut those off and bag them up and get rid of them. Come back later in the season, see what you missed, try to cut those off. The problem with some of these is if you just cut the stems off and leave the roots behind, they're just going to resprout and flower later. And some things, yeah, if you like the thistles, if you cut them when they're seeded, you have to get rid of them because even though they're cut off, the seeds will continue to mature in the head, even though they're not connected to anything, right? So you can't just cut them off or mow them down and just leave them there because the seeds will mature and you just put another year's worth of seed into the soil. And like we said earlier, these things the seeds stay viable for 20 years. So you're going to have to do this like every year until they stop coming up or you get it controlled to some level that you're happy with. And the Scotch thistles, those were brought in as ornamentals. And I got online, you can still buy the seeds for those things and plant them in your garden. I do not understand.
I could stop our gift shop manager
Yeah.
from doing that. Has there, so question from Zoom, has there been any advancement on Los Alamos County removing Siberian elm on public property?
Well, I've seen where they've done some of it. I don't know where we are with that, but up on Arizona, they've girdled some of the trees and some of them have died, some of them haven't. Some of the smaller trees, so there's the big trees growing along the street and they've produced seed and that seed has come up down below and they went along and cut those. And I suspect they probably treated those because most of them are dead, but there's still a lot of seedlings. They didn't either they didn't bother to pull the seedlings or they've come up since they were treated. So there's still a lot of seedlings in those areas. But yeah, they've tried girdling and that sometimes it kills them, but then you're left with this big dead tree there that's still there. That's not really attractive.
True, but good snag tree.
Yeah, I guess the birds like them. Yeah.
Right. Are there thistles we want? And
Well,
how can we tell them apart from exotics?
there's definitely, I don't know, like maybe two or three natives up here, and they're usually much smaller than the three big thistles, the three big non-natives, the bull thistle, the nodding thistle, and the Scotch thistle. Those all get very big and robust plants. Most of our native thistles are much smaller, and I don't know. Craig, you have a comment on how to tell them apart? Pink flowers, and so the natives have pink flowers instead of purple flowers. Yeah. Okay. So in case you didn't hear that most of the natives have hairier leaves, so they look kind of gray colored rather than green. As Scotch thistle is kind of the same way. It has a lot of hairs on it, so it kind of okay. Scotch thistle is more limited. So yeah, if it's out in the woods someplace, it's probably a native, especially if it's relatively small. So yeah, we don't need to pull those up.
This is actually a great segue into my second question, which is, do you have any pointers for identification? Like there are a lot of plants coming up right now and they do
Right.
not have their flowers yet. What is the best way to identify them?
It's different for different species. Yeah, it's hard to give like any kind of broad generalization. It's not like these exotics have some kind of a sign on them saying I don't belong here. Yeah. So it just depends on the species. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know how I would answer that. If you're interested in one particular species, then get online and look at a lot of photos and kind of get an idea of what they look like. Like there's right now in this canyon behind my house, there's that spurge, that myrtle spurge coming up, and the toad flax coming up, and they kind of look alike before they flower. They've got this kind of spurge-looking stem, and then once they flower, I can, I mean, I can tell them apart now. But initially, I thought I was seeing a lot of spurge in there, and then they started flowering, and there were these toad flax. So some things, are kind of hard to tell apart initially until they flower. Yeah, once they flower, that's obviously the key thing you're looking for to identify what species they are is you're going to use the flowers.
Got it. Someone did
Oh,
just give it a resource. They said Noxious and Troublesome Weeds of New Mexico by Leslie Beck.
yeah. Yeah, be good. And yeah, you can Google noxious weeds in New Mexico and get a lot of information aside from just the list. The state produces a little booklet that has photos and descriptions of the ones on the state list anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So is Dalmatian toadflax the same thing as butter and eggs? Yeah, that's another name for Dalmatian toadflax. Oh, yellow toadflax is butter and eggs? Yeah. Yeah, and the flowers they're mostly yellow with like a little orange lip on them. They both kind of look the same. The leaves are the easiest way to tell those two apart. Anything else? Yeah, in the back. Oh, yeah, I leave that up to the experts to tell me which ones have. So these are the ones, and these are the ones we talked of. Those four are, that's kind of like nationwide. I don't know if there are really many other types of exotic thistles around. It seems like, we've got them all right here. So yeah, most of them, other than Canada thistle, they're much bigger than our natives. Most of the natives anywhere. I'm not that familiar with native thistles. There's a bunch in New Mexico. There's probably a couple dozen native thistles throughout the state. I don't think any of them get that big, do they? Not, yeah, not that I know of. Yeah. Southern Europe. Oh, absolutely. So the question was, do people in Asia and North Africa and Southern Europe have our plants as weeds? Absolutely. They've got our plants. I couldn't tell you which ones right offhand, but absolutely. What's that? Pines? Oh, okay. Pines in South Africa and Australia. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We've done our share of exporting weeds to their areas as well. So it's a problem everywhere. Yeah. Oh, I'm not familiar with spotted spurge. Okay, so yeah, the comment was about someone has spotted spurge in their in their yard. And I'm not, and it's an annual. And yeah, I'm not familiar with. Do you know? Just taking a guess. Might be oh, like a little native euphorbia or Chamaecyparis type. Yeah. Okay. I see what you're probably right. There's I think several species of the little is like kind of low growing forms a little mat kind of thing. Yeah, they turn kind of reddish. Yeah, they've got the little euphorbia. Milky sap, milky sap. I don't know if those are I haven't really looked at those. I just assumed they were all native, but yeah. Oh, is that right? Okay, the hawk moth caterpillars eat them. Yeah, but yeah, absolutely. I know what you're talking about. I've got those in my yard. They come up every summer as soon as it starts raining.
We do have a question on Zoom, sorry, just to keep them in the conversation. If we had to pick a few of these to attack in our own yards, which would be worth our time and effort?
The bird's age, absolutely. If you're asking for my input, yeah, get the bird's age. Yeah, cheatgrass, again, yeah, you can keep it out of your yard, but that's about the best you can do. It depends on what you can tolerate. Right? If you don't have allergies, then you don't need to worry about the birth age, I guess. And goat heads, I would say, tackle the goat heads. And we really don't want those to get started up here. Yeah, the real ones I'm concerned about, like the knapweeds that aren't really established. Yeah, if you find it in your yard, you should tell somebody. We'd kind of like to know it's, where it is, and then you might have to purchase some herbicide to really get a handle on some of those rhizomatous perennials. June, did you have a question? Right. Right. Yeah. So the comment was just trying to get natives established when, okay, first off, get rid of the gophers. I don't know if you have a gopher issue. I have a gopher issue, and I catch 9 or 10 of those things every year and try to get, and they still just keep coming back. And the strategy I've used at my place is like almost every year I go get a bag of blue grama and buffalo grass and maybe some other native grasses thrown in there, spread it all over and cross my fingers that it rains at the right time and keeps it all alive. And after 5 years, it's done pretty well. It's, it took several years for things to really get established, and you need like a good summer to soak everything and really get them established. And I think it takes persistence and patience. Well, yeah, and some money too. Yeah. Yes. So the comment was after the Cerro Grande fire, they reseeded, and did it do any good or did it do any harm? And I wish I could tell you there were four species that they used, and from what I've seen, I think it did good. They weren't particularly persistent. I don't know if a lot of that stuff is still up there anymore, but you seed it to try to stabilize the soils. Of course, you're going to get a lot of soil erosion anyway, particularly in an area like this where you get summer monsoon rains that come in right after the fire. So nothing's established. You get a lot of erosion and runoff. But the grasses I should say I was part of that effort too. And we used some of that same seed mix on the lab when I was working there. And I think it did some good. It came up, it helped stabilize things. And now, 24 years later, there isn't a lot of that seeded stuff around that I can tell. And the natives have come back in and it looks probably as good as we could hope. So I think it did some good, and there was concern about introducing things like cheatgrass and whatnot, weeds, because there's always a certain percentage of weed seed in any of that seed mix that they use. But it's I haven't noticed that the cheatgrass is taking over, at higher elevations. I don't know that it really does that well. So I would say it worked out relatively well. Like it was probably a good idea in the long run. I don't know that we knew at the time that all of that stuff would eventually go away. There was concerns that we were putting stuff that wasn't really native out there and we would have to live with it. But as it turns out, it hasn't really stuck around.
Speaking of cheatgrass, we had another comment on Zoom, which is, it is so hard to defeat. Um, uh, Problems embedding in pets' ears, stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Is there a is pulling the best method of eradication?
Yeah. Yeah. You could mow it, I guess, but it's just going to put new seeds on, right? And it's an annual grass. It comes out pretty easily, especially go out after a rain and it'll come right out. You can pull it out pretty easily. And yeah, I would say pulling is probably to get rid of the ones that are there. The next best thing is to just try to get natives established. Once you get some natives established, the levels of cheatgrass will go down. And yeah, it is probably, I didn't talk about some of the little annual barleys, the Hordeum jubatus. Those are natives, but you mentioned it gets into your dog's face. Those things are really nasty. They're native. I didn't talk about them, but those things are kind of nasty too because they are the seeds that come off are real pointy and they get lodged in fur, and then you're for livestock and things like that. They'll actually get into the skin and cause abscesses. And I had to take my dog to the vet one time years ago. One got up his nostril. I could just see the on sticking out, and I couldn't get it out. I had to take it into the vet, and they had to like knock him out and get in there and pull that nasty thing out of there. So yeah, some of the natives are, can be problematic too. But it was interesting when I was putting together slides and species for things I wanted to talk about. It's like I didn't run across hardly any native weeds. Everything I was looking up, finding in my yard, and looking into, they all turned out to be, except for the burr sage, they all turned out to be exotics. Yeah.
We have one more question on Zoom, which is horseweed native?
Horseweed. What is horseweed?
Horseweed.
What's that? Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, yes, that's native. Yeah. And yeah, you'll see a lot of that again, mostly in disturbed areas, I think, and doesn't really cause a lot of problems. It's easy to pull it up, throw it in the trash. Yeah. Anything else? Got one over there? Okay, so the comment was that I had mentioned earlier might be a good idea not to put weed seeds in the brown bin, which go to the composting facility. And you mentioned that they may have changed their composting process to better handle those seeds. And I think for the most part, if they reach the appropriate temperatures in the composting piles, windrows, whatever, it'll kill a lot of seeds. I don't know that it'll kill all of them. Some of them are pretty resistant to heat, and it'll probably kill most of them. But if you're just dealing with some bundles that you pulled out of your yard, it might be a better idea to bag them up and throw them in the trash. But I I don't know. I haven't really looked at the county website. I don't know if they have a list exactly. Yeah, and show us the research that tells us it's okay to put all these weeds into the compost, and we're not, like giving it to all of our neighbors.
And we are at time. So if anyone has any additional questions, please, if you're in the room, ask them at the end of this, or you can always add them to the evaluation they'll get at the end of this program. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us, both virtual and in person. Thank you, of course, Sam. You did such an amazing job. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. I appreciate your attention and interest.
Perfect. And we hope everyone joins us for more peak programs like the Black Holes Full Dome movie that's showing tomorrow at 7 p.m. We have many, many options. Visit our website for those. And again, thank you. Have a good night.